the silence was deafening. Within the heart of Beijing lies Tiananmen Square, a symbol and battleground for the Chinese people and their cries. In 1989, the Chinese government's enactment of martial law on protesters in Tiananmen Square balanced citizens' rights with the state's responsibility to enforce stability and party control. In prioritizing authority over freedom, the government backlashed with excessive use of force, established lasting speech restrictions, and continuously regulated over Chinese media. After the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, gained power in 1949, China began reorganizing itself into a socialist state with a central economy, controlling many key industries. The Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, and other programs and/or policies led by Mao were intended to quickly modernize and implement communism in China, but instead they produced disintegration in terms of state economy, famine, and political instability. After the death of Mao Zedong in 1976, China began to sway away from the radical Maoist policies under Deng Xiaoping. With the Chinese opening of the state to foreign ideas during the 1980s and 90s, its economy and political prowess rose, but so did its corruption and inflation. Initially led by students, protests advocating for government reforms and press freedom opposed this increase, but these quickly developed into a mass movement involving people from the working class. Most of the inspiration for the movement derived from ideals of bourgeois liberalism, embodying concepts like individual rights, accountable government, and the rule of law. While some of the CCP understood the protesters' as cause, the rest were divided as they saw the protests as a threat. However, one of the pro-reformists, Hu Yaobang, the general secretary of the CCP, advocated for the political and social reform the students demonstrated, and symbolized the democracy and anti-corruption they fought to attain. After his forceful resignation in 1987, many reformists and protesters saw him as a martyr for his ideas. And on the day of April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang's sudden death sparked the flames of the Tiananmen Square protests. Thousands would gather in front of Tiananmen Square, Beijing, marching and protesting.
One of the most incredible things I witnessed prior to the military crackdown was the building of the goddess of democracy in Tiananmen Square, directly across from the giant Mao portrait. A dramatic juxtaposition of democracy versus communism. I witnessed hundreds of thousands of protesters with happy faces. It was almost like a carnival atmosphere. Everyone knew there was something special in the air, but I'm not really sure if the students fully comprehended the short freedom they obtained.
As these protests rose, the division in the Chinese government grew as well, with Premier Li Peng and CCP elder Deng Xiaoping describing the demonstrations as undermining the government, whereas other leaders like Zhao Ziyang and Hu Yaobang believed these protests were acceptable and fair. In anticipation of a visit from the Soviet Party's Mikhail Gorbachev in mid-May, a hunger strike in Tiananmen, started by a few hundred protesters, turned into thousands, led by the democratic rights they believed they deserved. After failing to suppress the strike and the embarrassment it brought, the Chinese government was yet again conflicted about either conforming to the students' demands for greater dialogue rights or sustaining its political integrity. However, on May 17, 1989, Deng Xiaoping decided that instituting martial law in the region would be a more optimal decision than accepting those demands. With the institution of martial law in Tiananmen Square, the People's Liberation Army, or PLA for short, occupied the area but were blocked by civilian protesters. Being ordered not to fire on civilians no matter the situation, they were pushed aside and unable to reach the center. As demonstrations continued, the CCP was left with deciding on using military force to put down the quote-unquote counter-revolutionary riots. On June 3rd, as word spread on the decision, thousands would flood the square in an attempt to block them, but at about 10:30 p.m., their lives would change forever. As protesters threw rocks and set vehicles on fire, the PLA would begin unloading their arsenal on the unarmed civilians. Rapid firing, soon accompanied by bursts of machine gun fire, echoed through the night as the army advanced into Tiananmen Square and broke the wall of resolve built by the protesters. They entered the square. Caught off guard, the people began to panic, as many were hospitalized or even killed on sight. The crackdown had begun. A message collected by a special task force in Washington labeled TFCH01 said that armed PLA soldiers were advancing tanks, trucks, and armed personnel carriers from all directions towards the city center. At this point, the estimated number of casualties was overwhelmingly high. Taken by surprise by the sudden resort of violence, protesters rushed to escape to safety. Embassy staff shared horrifying interactions with citizens who had witnessed unimaginable horrors. One woman recounted a tank driving over 11 people, their bodies mangled under its treads. Others reported PLA soldiers breaking windows of banks, shops, and buildings, a violence beyond the protesters alone.
I was like a soldier following orders during a war, but without any weapon or body protection. It was terrifying, the whole duration, and I really thought I was going to die on several occasions.
Student movement leaders were faced with the decision of either staying in the square and risking their lives against the government's political unity, or abandon their cause for democracy and speech rights. Among those leaders, Jayden, a 23-year-old student, was a vocal figure among protesters.
I think these could be my last words.
She felt conflicted between devotion to the cause and the guilt of having to give up. Despite this, she knew that even if they surrendered, the government would pursue, killing not only the protesters, but everyone who had stood behind their causes as well. Ling and many other Chinese people once saw visions of changing the course of the world and showing China the potential of democracy, but now it was time to face reality. With the legacy of the massacre leaving a dent in its image, the Chinese government sought to suppress knowledge of the event by any means possible. Directly after the event, the government proclaimed it a big lie, summarized in a government report. This report would illustrate the Tiananmen Square Incident not as a military crackdown, but rather as a massacre of Chinese soldiers from student hooligans, with the official number of casualties being only 300. In its cultural amnesia, the Chinese government would not teach nor mention the June 4th massacre in Chinese schools and newspapers in an attempt to avoid staining their legitimacy as a unified nation. As the government restricted the educational knowledge of the Tiananmen Square Incident, it only further attacked the Chinese people's entitlement to speech, in which they could not teach younger generations about the civil protests that occurred before and during the crackdown. Several Chinese people proclaimed the struggle in which June 4th was only a date, and that they were being fed propaganda about the event. Many Chinese people in their 20s to 30s were never exposed to the truth of what happened to protesters at Tiananmen Square. It was merely a part of history textbooks scratched out. Fear and realization became evident as students and Chinese citizens began to understand the extent of the Chinese government's suppression of speech dissent, and even the possibility of them doing it again. Researchers and students are only exposed to the truth of the Tiananmen Square incident through accident. Web surfing, family debates, and memorials are the only sources of information that initiate these people to learning more about the incident. The Chinese government did not limit its suppression of the Tiananmen Square incident to physical schools and media, but rather to the virtual world as well. Regardless of the unfair constraint it may have had on Chinese speech, the government felt it necessary to impose its authority on social media to maintain its image. When looking at one of the world's top social media messaging platforms, WeChat, government authority is evident. Being strictly run by a Chinese company, all images and posts on WeChat regarding politics were run through identifying systems, which censored and monitored the platform. To ensure its integrity, the Chinese government felt obligated to restrict any output that may negatively portray China. Designed as a space for sharing views and information, disabling these aspects on WeChat only removes the Chinese population's ability to express their opinions and voices freely. Users from across the world faced this censorship, especially when talking or even referring to the Tiananmen Square incident. They were suspended and even permanently blocked when sharing images or information about the event, which their images would be hidden from other users.
Democracy can't be achieved by one generation.
Swearing on her life that if she survived, Jayden would devote her life working to gain freedom for her children. The massacre at Tiananmen Square laid bare a painful truth. To the CCP, holding on to power mattered more than the rights and lives of its people. Students and many other Chinese people believed in change. They had stood their ground, spoken out, and starved because they thought their voices could be heard. But from the government's view, they weren't future leaders, martyrs, or citizens. They were a threat. The force that ripped the crowds of people apart weren't just to stop the protests. It was to make sure they wouldn't do it again. In the end, all the silence that followed was deafening. But each and every death in the Tiananmen Square incident has echoed throughout history. Even to this day, their dreams of a freer future of expression are too stubborn to die.